So, without further ado, let me introduce Bruce. So Bruce Feiler, a Savannah native, is here to talk about his extraordinary life and his life in transitions. And let me use this as a little example around you never know the impact that you are going to have at any given moment. The first time I ever met Bruce Feiler, I was 18 years old. I was graduating from Savannah Country Day, sitting on the stage, and he was our commencement speaker. And do you know what he talked about? He talked about travel. And you know why that resonates? It resonates because he went out and got outside perspective. That is so critically important to go out, get outside perspective, and bring it back. And so with that, I'm going to have Bruce bring his outside perspective as a Savannah native back here and talking about life in the transition. Bruce.
So my mic has been turned. Yeah, great. It's just, I do love the idea of travel, but I also love the idea of coming home. And it's very meaningful for me to stand here this morning and to see all of you with this beautiful sun shining through the window, committed to making this town a better place. And in honor of that, I'm actually going to tell a story now that has never been told publicly. And the story is about what you are doing here and how you are building on the shoulders of the giants who helped change this community over and over and over again in its history. We are standing here, or sitting here, in the case of many of us right now, in Trustees Garden, where, as we all know, in February of 1733, this town, this state was formed. And in the original charter of the state of Georgia, when it was found, for those of you, just to kind of remind you of the story, there were basically Protestants in the Carolinas and there were Catholics down in Florida, and the Catholics were kind of creeping up the coast, and the Protestants in the Carolinas felt threatened. So they took debtors out of prison in London and they sent them and they set up this new colony in Georgia in February of 1733. And the original charter said there were going to be no papists, meaning no Catholics, okay? There were no slaves, interestingly enough, because that didn't hold for very long, and de facto, no Jews. Now, I come from 5 generations of Jews in Georgia, and so Jews, like the Catholics, were not originally welcomed here. But just to remind you of the story, Georgia was founded in February of 1733, and then there was a pandemic that hit that spring, and it killed a large number of the original colonists, including the only doctor. Now, there was a ship of Portuguese Jews that was on its way to the Caribbean, blew off course, and in July of 1733 ended up off the coast of Savannah. And as if we were writing the cliche, guess who was on board the ship? A doctor. So the town said, would you please come in and help us because we need a doctor in this town? And as I'm very fond of joking, the doctor, Dr. Nunez, said, it was the opposite of Moses, let my people in. So the colonists got off and set up the third oldest congregation in the country. And from that moment, Savannah began to become diverse. And on the Catholic story, I note that next month, the St. Patrick's Day parade in Savannah, Georgia will celebrate its 200th anniversary. It began in 1824 when the population of Savannah was fewer than 7,000 people. So diversity, though it might not have been in the original charter, has been key to the history of Georgia all along. And there were people that helped build this story. So my family has been here since the 1850s, and my father, it was originally the Cohens and then the Feilers, and my father, Ed Feiler, who some of you know, was one of those giants who helped build this community. And in the early 1970s, the Chamber of Commerce came to my father, and this is the story that's never been told publicly, and asked him to begin Leadership Savannah. And the idea was to do exactly what you're doing in this room, right? To bring people together and to help build the future. And my father agreed on 3 conditions. Condition number 1, that he be allowed to make the class racially diverse, to reflect the racial makeup of Savannah. Number 2, he insisted that it be gender diverse and be half men and half women. And he insisted that it be politically diverse and all viewpoints were welcome. And the chamber agreed, and Leadership Savannah got started in the early 1970s. But within a few years, my father hosted an event with Leadership Savannah on pollution. And for those of you who were around in the 1970s, you might remember pollution was a problem because of a particular employer on the west side of Savannah, as we heard the commission chairman say. And someone came to this and mentioned that a big polluter in Savannah was Union Camp. This was not welcome in Savannah in the early 1970s. And the next morning, my father was summoned to the people who ran the city at the time and informed that he was being removed from his role of running Leadership Savannah. And they actually went to his office a few blocks away and took the checkbook, which had a balance of $27 in it. That's how tightly my father ran the budget. Anybody else, I would suggest if this happened to, would have gone to the paper, would have made this story public. But for my father, the most important thing is what was in the best interest of Savannah, and he kept that story secret for 40 years and never told it publicly until I got the story out of him in the last months of his life, and he's written it in a memoir that we're going to publish later this year. And so what you're doing today matters essentially. That you meet one another, that you connect across racial, gender, political grounds, because as we all know, there are people out there who want to divide us, and there are people out there who want to say we are polarized and cannot get along. That will hold us back. And so just at the start of this, I want to say, because it means so much to me personally, that I'm going to congratulate Charles and all the sponsors. What you're doing matters, essentially. Yes, let's... Stop for a second and listen to the story going on in your head. It's there in the background. It's the story of where you came from, where you are right now, and where you want to go. It's the story that you flip through in your mind when you're looking at photographs, when you pass an old place that you may have known, when you get called and have to rush to the hospital. It's the story of who you are. It's the story of your life. And in the last few years, there's been a breakthrough in how we understand stories. And we've come to learn that stories are how we are wired to to understand the world and to make sense of the world and to share our own understanding of who we want to be. Life is the story you tell yourself. It's not part of who you are, it is who you are in a fundamental way. Recently, something happened to me that changed the way I understand the story we tell. I lost the plot of that story. I didn't know who I was. I didn't know how to tell my story. I didn't know how to move forward. This is the story of what I did once I discovered that I was losing track of my story and how it changed everyone around me. So as I said, and as you know, and as Charles was kind enough to mention, I grew up in this town. For me, I was the 5th generation Georgian Jew. And I left here in the 1980s, and I went northeast to go to college, and then I went to Japan, and I'm older than many of the people in this room, but maybe not everyone, and I started writing letters home on crinkly airmail paper. You know, the kids today don't understand what that was. There were no lines on it. The pad had the top of the pad had the lines so that you wouldn't write all squiggly. And when I got back home 6 months later, everywhere I went, people said, "I loved your letters." And I was like, "Great, have we met?" And it turned out that my grandmother had Xeroxed them and passed them around, and they went viral in the sort of 1980s sense of the word. And I thought, if this is that interesting to me and to all these people, like, I should write a book about it. I didn't know anyone who'd ever written a book. I actually went to the Chatham-Effingham County Public Library, which I passed on my way here this morning, and I checked out the only book on publishing, which was a book about propaganda in World War II, which was not particularly helpful. And it doesn't really happen this way, but I sold my first book 35 years ago at age 24, and I've never held a job since. In my 20s, I wrote books about Japan and about England. I spent a year as a circus clown. In my 30s, I went back and forth to the Middle East, writing books and making television about the Bible and religion and how we make sense of spirituality today. And in the context of the conversation that I want to have with you for the next few minutes, I think of this now as a kind of classic linear life. Like I figured out what I wanted to do early. I did it for no money. Then I got married. Then I had some success. Then I got married and had children. Like, this is the fantasy linear life that we're all told that we want to live. And then, and until in my 40s, when my life blew up. First of all, as many of you know, I got cancer at 43 as a new dad of 3-year-old identical twin daughters. I wrote a memoir about that called Council of Dads, which later became the TV show that NBC filmed here right before the pandemic. Then I had financial troubles in the last recession. And then my father, this great town elder, one of the giants, as I said, who helped build this city in the late 20th century, got Parkinson's, became very depressed, and tried to take his own life 6 times in 12 weeks. So suddenly, here I was, a storyteller, unable to tell my story. I felt fear and shame and sadness and confusion. A few months before this experience happened with my father, I was in Atlanta and I went to see a man named Marshall Duke. I was writing a book called The Secrets of Happy Families, and Marshall did pivotal research at Emory University in which he found out that children who know more about their family history are better able to navigate the ups and downs of their lives. It was the #1 predictor of a child's emotional well-being. And I asked Marshall why this was, and he said, families have 3 types of narratives. You have an ascending narrative. Okay, I came from nothing, I worked hard, I have a lot. Then there's a descending narrative. We had a lot, then there was a war or a recession or a natural disaster, and we lost everything. Or there's an oscillating narrative. And children who understand that there are natural ebbs and flows, that there are ups and downs, are better able to navigate their own ups and downs in their lives. And here I was in one of those downs in my own life and in my family. And inspired by this idea, one Monday morning, I sent my father a letter. I sent my father an email. Tell me about the toys you played with as a child. And he answered that, and then the next week I sent him another one. Tell me about the house you grew up in. And this began a process of using storytelling to help bring my father back to life. And when I began to tell this story, to other people, what I discovered is that everybody has moments in their lives when their lives feel like they're off track, or off schedule, or off kilter, or somehow off the natural axis of what they want. That the life they were living is not the life they expected to live. And I called my wife one night after telling this story publicly at a college reunion, and I said, no one knows how to tell their life story anymore. I want to do something to help. And what I did was create something I've called the Life Story Project. And over the last 7 years, I have collected now close to 500 life stories of Americans of all ages, all walks of life, all 50 states. People who lost limbs and lost homes, changed careers and changed religions, got sober and got out of bad marriages. And then with waves of teams of people, we've analyzed these stories looking for patterns that can help all of us in times of change. And what I've learned is that how we navigate change, how we navigate, as the commission chair shared with us a few minutes ago, the changes, the transitions, the ups and downs of our lives and those around us, is the essential tool for how we survive in the time that we're in now. And so what I want to talk about here in the next few minutes is what I've learned in this project. And let's start with the 3 big lessons. Lesson number 1, the linear life is dead. The linear life is the idea that all of our lives are predictable, that they follow predictable phases of change. And the only meaningful times of transition we have are around birthdays that end in 0. This idea is not only wrong, it's a complete historical aberration. So if you go back to the ancient world, they didn't believe in the linear life, right? Because they didn't have clocks or time. They thought life would follow the agricultural cycle of moving through the seasons, to every season, turn, 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 in the book of Ecclesiastes. It was actually the Hebrew Bible that introduces the idea of linear time, okay, that we all come from one family. But in the Middle Ages, when Christianity was the dominant force in Western culture, they thought that life was a staircase up to middle age, that we all peaked in middle age, and then we went straight down, okay? So that's no new love at 60, no retiring and moving to Savannah and starting an B&B or an Airbnb. Like, it's straight up and it's straight down. It wasn't until the rise of science in the 19th century that the idea of the linear life begins to get locked in. And the way this works is the way we look at the world around us affects how we look at our lives. Okay, so this was the industrial age, when there were assembly lines and conveyor belts and factories. Okay, and so you look at the 20th century, all of the big ideas followed this linear path. Okay, Freud says we go through various stages. Piaget says children go through development. Okay, Erikson, there are 8 stages of moral development. The 5 stages of grief, the hero's journey. These are all linear constructs. And this idea reaches its peak in the 1970s, when a woman named Gail Sheehy writes a book called Passages, which says that everyone does the same thing in their 20s, everyone does the same thing in their 30s, and that everyone has a midlife crisis between 39 and 44 and a half. Like, that's how precise it was. And this idea, this book sold 20 million copies. Many of our parents and grandparents read this book. It built the idea that a midlife crisis is something that everybody has, and here's the problem. It's complete bunk. There is absolutely no research that backs any of this up. Take something like the pandemic. If you were between 39 and 44 and a half, you were having a midlife crisis. But if you were between 22 and 31, you were also having a crisis. If you were between 58 and 64, you were in crisis, or in the case of my children, teenagers. The truth is, these events happen whenever, which leads to the second point. So the linear life is dead. The nonlinear life involves many more life transitions. My data show that we all go through what I call a disruptor every 12 to 18 months, okay? That's more often than some people in this room see a dentist, okay? So a disruptor could be something small, like twisting your ankle or getting a fender bender, or something big, like losing a loved one or having a natural disaster, which, as we know, hit this part of the world somewhat frequently. Most of these, good news, we get through relatively easily. But 1 in 10 of these becomes what I call a lifequake, which is a massive burst of change that leads to a time of confusion and pain, but also renewal and reimagining. The average person goes through 3 to 5 lifequakes in the course of our lives. And here is the signature piece of data in the 7 years I've been doing this, is that the average length of time that someone takes to get through a lifequake is 5 years. So you do the math, 3 to 5 lifequakes in the course of our lives. The average length is 4, 5, or 6 years. That's 25 years. That's half of our adult lives we are spending in transition. And we are being told, just grit your way through it, or grind your way through it, or suffer your way through it, like life will look better on the other end. No. This is half of our lives. If we just say it's a miserable period, we are writing off half of our lives right in the middle of our lives. And this leads to the third point. Life transitions are a skill that we can and must master. It is the dominant, essential skill of being a leader in the 21st century, learning to navigate change. We didn't even know this. We haven't even spoken. You stood up here, I counted, you used the word transition 3 times to say this town is in transition. And that's what's going on. You are in transition. Your employees, or partners, or family members are in transition. And your community is in transition. If you look at these as miserable periods, you are missing the opportunity before us. And so this is a skill that you can master. It's essential to your family, it's essential to your organizations, and it's essential to your community. So in the few minutes I have before we open this up to questions, I want to quickly give you 5 tools to help you navigate your transitions and those you care about better. Tip number 1. Use your transition superpower. Okay, so you're in a transition. So what is a transition, okay? The core idea is that the lifequake is the event that puts you on your heels, right? It's the thing that upsets you, that overwhelms you, that you feel confused. The life transition is the human response to the lifequake. So if the lifequake puts us on our heels, the life transition puts us on our toes, and we choose to make growth and get ourselves better and back on track during it, okay? Now, what happens is when you get in transition, people do one of two things. They either make a 212-item to-do list, and they say, I'm going to get through the transition in a weekend, and I'm going to be the best ever, and I'm going to get a blue ribbon and a gold star. I won't ask how many people in this room, though, if you're a leader at your leadership conference, that probably applies to many people in this room. I'm for sure it applies to Charles, because I've just heard him say he's going to run this thing, within an inch of its life. But there's another group of people, and when they enter transition, they lie under the covers in a fetal position with their cat, and they say they're never going to get through it, okay? So both of these are wrong. But you look at enough of these events, and it turns out they have a certain structure, okay? Transitions have three parts. There's what I call the long goodbye, where you're saying goodbye to the world you're leaving behind. There's the messy middle, where you're shedding habits and experimenting with new ones. And then there's the new beginning, where you unveil your new self. And here's the thing. Everybody is good at one of these. You're a transition superpower, and you're bad at one of these. You're kryptonite. Like, maybe you're good at turning the page. Okay, that's done. Goodbye. Never going to talk about it again. I know a lot of people who get sick, who get cancer. My mother's one of these people I'm never going to talk about again. There's other people who want to, put on the yellow ribbon and march in the parades and be very active. Like, some people like to turn the page, some people like to stay behind. The messy middle, a lot of people are bad at it, but some people like it. They like making lists and like getting better. And even the new beginning can be hard. I'm a recent empty nester. It's a little hard to embrace the new beginning when you're still looking at the long goodbye. Identify which one you're best at and start there. Because here's the thing, nobody does these in order. Just like life is nonlinear, life transitions are nonlinear too. Start with what you're comfortable at, build some confidence, then go back and touch one of the other ones that you're less good at. Tip number 2, we're going to do one for each of the 3 phases, okay? The first one is accept your emotions. I've looked hundreds of people in the eye and asked the question, what was the biggest emotion you struggled with in your time of change? Number 1 answer, fear. How am I going to get through it? How am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to live without that loved one? Number 2, sadness. I'm sad. I liked my life before that happened, okay? I wish that I hadn't gotten sick. I'm sorry that that person died. Number 3 was interesting to me, and that's shame. I'm ashamed of what I did when I was drinking too much. I'm ashamed that I have a child with an anxiety disorder. I'm ashamed that I have to ask for help. These are deeply emotional times. It's essential that you accept that it's emotional and then use ritual of some kind to mark it. People have farewell parties. I talked to someone who her husband got sick and she had to give a bone marrow transplant, and she was going through a seriously difficult time. And at the end of this year, she said, what's my biggest fear? It's heights. She jumped out of an airplane in order to give herself the confidence to turn the page from the long goodbye to the next phase that she was entering. So accept that it's an emotional experience, particularly those of you who like to make a lot of lists and don't want to confront your emotions. You got to go back and confront them if you really want to get the best out of the transition. Tip number, I think I'm up to 3. Okay. Experiment with new creative acts. The messy middle of a transition involves 2 things. 1, we shed habits, okay? We shed some things that we liked, but also we usually have things about us that we didn't like. I talked to a woman who got divorced and went through a career change and got cancer all in the same year. She said she finally shed the habit of, because she was unhappy in her relationships, she'd walk home from work every day, open the fridge, and eat whatever she saw. So she finally identified that habit. She shed 60 pounds, and that was the thing about her that she didn't like, that she shed. Maybe you're a people pleaser, okay? Maybe you are a perfectionist. Maybe you stop yourself from trying new things. So pick a habit that you don't like about yourself and shed it, which makes room for the next, which is the most powerful thing I encountered, which is people are incredibly creative at the bottom of their lives. And not just creative in the abstract sense, they paint birdhouses, they pick up those ballet shoes in the back, they start twirling batons. I actually ran into someone recently whose story that I gave, and in a very difficult transition, she was having a political change and a job change. She taught herself ukulele, because she said even a fool can sound good on a ukulele, and it gave her confidence. I talked to a guy, Zach Taylor. He was a black man who was adopted by a white family in Kansas and kind of wandered through his life, ended up in the US military, ended up in Afghanistan, where he had his face shot off by the Taliban. 31 surgeries between the tip of his nose and the tip of his chin, including having his tongue sewn back on. He had it all: depression, suicide ideation, and he told me that the thing that saved him is his mother moved to Walter Reed to help him and said, he had to teach himself, you should start cooking. He had to teach himself how to cook because his entire palate had changed. And then he started writing poetry and then painting. And he said, you know how that guy used to make art by splattering paint against the canvas? Well, I used to do that by splattering the enemy with bullets, and now I do it with painting. And now he runs a company that helps wounded warriors paint. He started his own company, and it was the creativity that brought him back to life. In the bottom of your life, when you do not believe, think the pandemic. What was the way we all got through the pandemic, right? Baking, right? We're going to sourdough our way through this. Like, I was the least surprised person in America because that little act of getting your hands messy and baking that bread allowed us to think that we could bake a new life for ourselves. So 2 quick more tips, and then we're going to open it up for questions. But the next one is, nothing is more lonely than going through a difficult time. I remember when I had the leg problems that was brought on by a tumor in my left femur, and I was on crutches for 2 years and on a cane for a year after that. I would look out the window and say, that person doesn't have trouble walking. That person can just put their child on their shoulders in a way that I couldn't do. You feel incredibly isolated. Don't be isolated. Reach out to someone. If you're going through a transition now, reach out to someone. If someone you know, if you're not, congratulations, reach out to someone you know who's suffering. But here's the thing, people want different support. Some people like comforters. I love you, Rob. I believe in you. You'll get through it. Some people like nudgers. Okay, I love you, Elizabeth, but I think maybe you should try this, and maybe you should try that. And other people like what I call slappers in a sort of metaphoric sense. I love you, Charles, but I'm tired of hearing the story. Like, it's time for you to get off your sofa and go do something. Go fix one of those problems that you've identified. Don't assume that what you want from a friend in a time of need is what that friend needs. Ask before you advise. And this leads to the 5th point that I want to say, which is write a new story. And to me, it's the theme of this whole event is let's help Savannah write a new story, and Chatham County and Southeast Georgia and this state and, God willing, our entire country. A life transition is what I call an autobiographical occasion, which is this academic word that's been forgotten from the 80s I want to bring back. And that's an occasion when you have to tell your story. Like when you go see a doctor, that's an autobiographical occasion, right? Or you go on a first date, or you sit next to someone on a plane. It's a chance to tell your story. And here's the thing. A story has no meaning. You have to give the story meaning. You have to decide what you want the story to be. And we are in a moment when meaning is the central act that we all need. If you go back 100 years ago, we had to live where our parents wanted us to live, do what our parents wanted us to do, believe what our parents wanted us to believe, love who our parents wanted us to love. We live in a different time. You can live where you want to live, do what you want to do, love who you want to love, believe who you want to believe. It's an incredible opportunity, but it comes with a burden. Sometimes we get stuck, we get frozen, we get writer's block writing the story of our lives. And here's what I've learned. There are 3 building blocks that give us meaning. I call them the ABCs of meaning. The A is agency, what we do, what we make, what we create. The B is belonging, our friends, our relationships, our loved ones. And the C is a cause, a calling, something higher than ourselves. And when we go through transitions, we adjust. So maybe we've been doing something for ourselves and now we want to give back. Or maybe we've been raising children and our children go off to college, as just happened to me, and we say, I want to now give back or do something for myself. Or maybe we've been helping others and get burned out and we want to make a shift. In times of transition, we readjust what gives us meaning. And looking out at all of you today, the sense I have is that you are here because you not only want to get better in your own life, but you want to help others. And you want to embrace the cause of improving our community. Make that change. And that's exactly what happened with my dad. When he began to work on those stories, after giving back to this town when he couldn't anymore, he started answering these questions week after week for 8 years, until just before he died in 2021, he finished a 65,000-word memoir. One question, one story, one chapter at a time. That is the power of story. And that is the power that we have the opportunity to harness today. The Italians have a wonderful expression for this. Lupus in fabula, the wolf in the fairy tale. The fabula is the fable. It's the fantasy of our lives when everything goes well. We all like that time. But also what happens is that the wolf shows up. That's the lupus. And the wolf could be a tornado, a downsizing, a diagnosis, a disease, a pandemic. Lupus and fabula, just when things are going well, the wolf will show up. And we want to banish the wolf. Oh, do we want to banish the wolf? But if you banish the wolf, you banish the hero. And if there's one thing I've learned, we all need to be the hero of our own story. That's why we tell fairy tales after all. Night after night, week after week, year after year. They help us turn our nightmares into dreams. Thank you very much. Jason, do we have time?
Bruce, that was incredible. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and I'm going to run around like a chicken with my head cut off, bringing you this microphone. Does anybody have a question for Bruce?
Come on, raise your hand. I know some of you by name, so I'm going to call on you if we don't get questions. Yes, ma'am.
How are you, Mr. Feiler? I don't have a question, but just a statement. I just want you to know that doing some calculations, I think I am in my 5th year of my life quake. So everything that you say is pretty much on point. And I have experienced every single thing that you've talked about, including incorporating the transitions into my life and accepting them. I also incorporated socio-emotional learning in my curriculum for my foundation for my youth development, and I think my students are doing well because they're understanding, what was it you said, the
oscillating narrative, yes.
Yeah, and me, myself as well. I started writing my story when I read Doug Conant's book about leadership and enjoying, understanding my life story. James Clear with habits and creating a system to develop and succeed at my habits as well. So I definitely thank you, and I will be incorporating everything else that you've spoken about into my life and everything else that I do. So I definitely thank you, and it was a very, very great, I hate to use the word very all the time, but it was a really great speech.
Thank you. Let me say I appreciate your honesty and sharing that in front of the group. And I will say the reaction to this work that I've had out talking about it now for a few years. I wrote a book called Life is in the Transitions about this and gave a TED Talk about this, and have now written a book about life transitions, and I'm now starting to work on a book about how families navigate transitions about ritual. I would say that the number one reaction to my work is kind of similar to what you've said, which is, this is a technical scientific term, but people say, phew, like you have named this thing that I'm feeling that I didn't know how to name for it. And I think that that's kind of what I've learned. When I first started working on this project, I kind of would walk around my house saying, why are we not talking more about transitions? Like, why hasn't there been a major book on this in 40 years? And people would sort of nod politely. And then, my book was supposed to come out in May of 2020. And of course, what happened was the pandemic changed everything. Because for the first time in a century, the entire planet was in a life transition at the same time. And so I think that what I've learned in the last 4 years of being out talking about this publicly is that naming it is incredibly helpful because it makes it less scary. When my twin daughters were going off to college this year, I was like, you're in a transition. Like, this is what's happening. That's why I appreciated what we heard earlier about this town is in a transition. And transitions, as you say, are periods of opportunity, but it's also painful. And Charles alluded to this. It's difficult. Some people are going to resist. So naming it tames it and helps us collectively turn the transition from back, what I said before, back from being on your heels to some time where we can be on our toes. Let's try to get a couple more. Yes, sir.
Hi, Bruce. Bill Stankiewicz here. Wonderful speech. Two-part question. 2 tips on a family that has recently lost someone due to a suicide, and B, how can you help a family that the attempted suicide did not go through, but they're just coping?
Thank you. I think this matters to me a lot. I've just stood up in a room full of people, many of whom may know me or my family or this story, and talked openly about mental health and suicide. So and one of the reasons that I do this, and originally I would say that there was you're about to do this, what? From members of my family, and my father was alive when this book was published and started hearing it, is that we need to remove the shame from this aspect of life. And as anybody, I have teenage daughters, everybody knows, okay, this is a crisis in this country, that social media is exasperating a problem, okay? A third of young people will have emotional problems. My children are at an Ivy League college right now. We were just told that 80%, 80, of students at this university will seek mental health counseling. So the most important thing is to create a permission structure where this is not a cause of shame, that this is an epidemic in this country and we must speak publicly about it. That's the first point. Second, there are incredible resources out there, okay, that can help families cope with these problems. And so rather than giving mental health advice from this stage, I will say there are great organizations. And in terms of someone who might have tried to, or considered, or planned to take their own life and did not succeed, then I think that the essential act is to find what gives them meaning today. Is it gardening? Is it storytelling like I did with my dad? Is it traveling? Is it helping other people? The moment that we're in is that everybody is deciding what gives them meaning at every moment. That's why we need a meaning language. The number one skill for a leader today, as I said earlier, is to adopt a meaning vocabulary and to talk about what gives you meaning in the organization and in your life. Because if you don't do it in your organization, people are going to leave because there's no longer a stigma against quitting a job. So it's find what gives that person meaning today and then lean into that. We have time for one more question, Charles?
Yes. Take it.
I had always been influenced by a book called The Road Less Traveled and Scott Peck and Life is Difficult and the 5 tools that are represented in that first chapter. I'm curious whether in your work you have ever used that as a resource or have observations on that set of tools.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember when The Road Less Traveled, because I feel like I had this when I lived in Savannah before I went away. And I think that one of the things, first of all, I just love when anybody will stand up at this moment in time and say that they got inspiration from a book, because books matter, and we live in an illiterate world where we can read books and people don't read books. So I'm just grateful that any book. I can't say there's one particular idea from that, but what brings me gratitude is that this is a popular form of book. Because what's happened in the world, okay? Psychology was invented 120 years ago, okay? And for the first century of psychology, it was all about deviants and sociopath and people who had kind of unhappy, ruinous lives. okay? And under the leadership of the former head of the American Psychology Association, at the turn of this century, there was this move to what's become called positive psychology. Like, let's find out what's working and what people who are happy and fulfilled and have meaning in their lives, what they do right, and then let's try to learn for them. So there's been a turn in the literature out there that's basically designed to get ideas into the world of people who are navigating these moments well and who have well-being in their life and who are able to find meaning. And that's what brings me gratitude and what makes me very hopeful. And so as I wrap up my time and I send you on to this day, let's keep coming back to this question over and over again. What story do I want to tell at this moment in my life? How does it affect me? How does it affect my family? And how does it affect my community? And how can I take what gives me meaning and help other people to live a happier and more fulfilled and more meaningful life? And if we do that, this is what I've learned in the years I've been doing this, you can make yourself happier. You can make members of your family happier, and you can make your community a better place. And what a great message and commitment to make at the beginning of this new year. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bruce.